Down by the Tracks by S.J. Curtice. In the town where I grew up, we had a set of railroad tracks that ran along the border with the city and the river. Between the tracks and down to the river was Turning Point Park, a hilly wooded section hidden behind the neighborhoods and businesses that had remained mostly untouched until a little over a couple of decades ago. There was indeed once a section that brought people to the Charlotte Fair from the inner city. Charlotte Beach housed a Ferris wheel and various other theme park attractions. In the 20s and 30s, it was a wondrous place. As well as being an attraction, Turning Point offered businesses many opportunities. This section of the Genesee River has an extra wide breadth where large ships could turn around, and this was once a major shipping area from 1887 until the 1970s, at which time the city of Rochester, New York, had decided to make the 275-acre woods into a municipal park. To this day, there is only one cement ship that still makes port at the docks, and the tracks are almost never used. One set is completely shut down. Now, just because they made it a park doesn't mean all you'll see are hikers on the trail and people walking dogs. No, not at all. This was also the spot for many illegal and adolescent activities. As a kid, my mother warned me of the bad kids at the tracks and was forbidden to go down there, even with friends. At this point in the 90s, it wasn't so much a park yet, as it was an ungoverned plot of land nestled between a suburb, a city, and a river. I would hear stories of older siblings who had messed around down there, drinking beers, smoking pot, having fires, and even one about a friend's brother who miscalculated how steep it was down the river gorge and drove their truck into the marshy shore. But it wasn't just the bad kids at the tracks that were a threat there. These woods have a few darker tales to tell. I suppose I should start with the oldest and most heinous acts that have happened here. Being a more widely known story, I won't spend as much time on it. By the late 1980s, a darkness would befall the city of Rochester by the name of Arthur Shawcross, perhaps better known to some as the Genesee River Killer. Having already killed numerous victims in the Vietnam War and in Waterloo, New York, Shawcross had made his way to Rochester and began a killing spree that would leave 11 sex workers dead in 2 years, becoming one of the city's most infamous serial killers. Now, why do I bring him up? Well, that's because Turning Point Park was his preferred dumping ground. The majority of his victims, after being subjected to brutal horrors of assault and mutilation, would be driven down to the river and had their lifeless bodies dropped off a ledge, down towards the water's edge, snaring on bushes and rocks, until finally coming to rest in the brush. Shawcross would show no mercy before, nor after, death. If you're interested to hear more, there are some unsettling interviews with him. But he is but one of the horrors these woods live with. There is also an arsonist. Somewhere in a house near the entrance to the tracks, which led to the park, lived a middle-aged man who presented himself as much of a hippie. Headband, tie-dye, biked everywhere. I'm sure you know the type. But for all the peace and love he portrayed, this man had a secret urge to destroy. Numerous times he was spotted setting fires in the brush along the bike trails by the tracks, often resulting in the fire department coming. By the time I was a teen, my friends and I stopped listening to our parents and figured we could be the bad kids at the track. Then no one would mess with us, right? Wrong. Our new little paradise was under attack by something we were poorly equipped to deal with: wildfires. Nothing will make you care more about conservation than falling in love with some woods and then having to fight for its life. This guy was seen by myself and friends riding up on his bike, lighting some paper, dropping it, and then riding to a safe distance to watch. On one occasion, a group of friends went down to go hang out at our usual fire ring, built up with rocks, which teens would use to burn the random items people would dump down at the tracks, hoping the train would hit their discarded items, like old computers, household wares, couches, furniture. One time somebody left a jet ski on the tracks to be hit by the train. A bit more than your usual pennies being flattened. So even though it was kind of dumpy, we loved the freedom it gave. So when we go down to our favorite spot and find it on fire, we bug out. My friends ended up having to call 911 because we couldn't contain it. But as they made their way down to us and started to put it out, one of us saw the hippie guy watching, then turning away to ride off, gone before we could catch him. The last time I knew of this happening was a few years later. I had gone there with a girl to the same spot, and we came across a huge section of dead leaves across the ground, on fire. I knew there wasn't much time before this was out of control and the whole forest would go up, so I started trying to stomp out the fire. I first made my way up the hill to try and kick the fire back to the center, but the leaves kept breaking up and going into my eyes and lungs. I pulled out a bandana to cover my face the best I could and continued. I kept going around the fire's edge, stomping and kicking until everything around the fire was burnt and put out, finally containing it. I realized I had this under control and the woods were safe. I eventually got the last of it put out, but my sneakers were blackened and the treads were melted flat. At that point, I thought of the hippie cyclist and cursed him, practically knowing it had to be him. A short while later, I noticed his house go up for sale and found out he had died in his sleep. I don't know how he was never caught and charged. I guess any evidence went up in smoke. But at least I know now the woods are safe from him. Now, not all of the dangers of Turning Point are human. Sometimes Mother Nature has her own brutality. A little farther south on the trails, you'll reach a section located behind Riverside Cemetery, a beautiful resting place for those of any denomination and a cut-through along the river trail. Being old woods, you can expect a lot of old growth, and with that can come dead trees. Due to the hilly and narrow nature of the trails, there is not much park maintenance can do, far from the paved pathways, especially the unofficial trails behind the cemetery. This would come to be particularly hazardous one day, 10 years ago, when the entire county was hit with a windstorm no one had seen the likes of. Telephone poles snapped, trees were uprooted, siding ripped off of houses, all at the mercy of 80-mile-an-hour gusts. It was this day that 2 cyclists made their way out onto the trails, not knowing what conditions awaited them. Who would have expected a once-in-a-lifetime storm? The father-son duo entered at the trailhead and followed the bumpy path south. To give themselves a bit more of a challenge, they opted for the off-path dirt trails that were steep and narrow, giving you little option to evade anything in your path, as maintaining your momentum was half the battle. During their ride, the winds would pick up, and more, until a level of concern came about them. They realized this was no ordinary wind, and they needed to get out of there, now. By this time in their ride, they had reached the line between the park and the cemetery. Thinking the wide-open vastness of the cemetery would be safer than below the trees, The two made their way up a hill so steep that they had to get off and walk their bikes up it. But it was too late. As they crested the hill, a dreadful gust blew through them, and an eerie cracking, then a snapping, then a loud pop, as a massive section of tree hurled itself onto the two bikers. On foot and carrying bikes, they had no chance. The limb landed on them, crushing them to death in an instant. It wasn't until cleanup operations began the next morning, clearing all the fallen branches, until a worker noticed a mangled bicycle beneath a section of tree. As he got closer, the reality of what he was looking at hit him and fell backwards. His colleagues looked on as he could only point at what he had found, for the sight had left him speechless. The father and son were found crushed to death, and 2 more victims would lay in this park. A couple of weeks later, a memorial would show up in the woods nearby, a structure of branches around wildflowers, a small fire pit with log benches, and a series of goodbye notes tacked to a tree. May they forever ride in peace. I have another story from a close friend as well. They have told me about a time where they went to the falls of Turning Point and experienced something unworldly. My friend Eric was with a girl named Ashley, and they decided to hang their legs off a cement barrier adjacent to the falls below. This waterfall goes down maybe 100 feet, and the two heard something. This girl was a known psychic and had determined there was something off about this place. The girl grasped the root of a nearby tree. She asked, "Can you hear the kid? He needs help." But as my friend reached over to help, the girl closed her eyes and said they needed to leave. It was later discovered that a boy had fallen down the waterfall years before, and his sister tried to help, but she was also swept down the falls, the two only to be found days later, deceased. My friend is still haunted by this experience. This last story is one of my own accounts. It takes place maybe 5 years ago in these same woods. Now, a little info on how the park has changed. Maybe 15 years ago, whatever municipality that was in charge of Turning Point Park had decided to make it a much more friendly and public park, paving paths, revamping the parking lot, as well as constructing a 1/4-mile-long walkway that went over the water and connected the north and south trails. An impressive achievement, making the entire river trail complete. But as I said, not all dangers here were man-made. Although man did create a superhighway for all sorts, which wildlife would use to navigate around civilization, this would lead to encounters with beavers, skunks, and even the occasional buck who would threaten to charge you. However, my story involves a rather inconspicuous attacker. Coming from the north end of the river, near the lake, my girlfriend at the time and I had taken it upon ourselves to have a midnight stroll down to the park from the harbor. We were chatting, smoking cigarettes, and taking sips off a bottle of wine when we came upon the walkway over the water. This walkway was built using steel and wood to connect various cement docks out in the water. So you would have a walkway, a big circular platform, then walkway, then platform, and so on. As we made our way along, we noticed movement at one of the platforms, but it wasn't people. It was much too small. As we approached, we saw that it was in fact 2 pit bull puppies, abandoned with no collars. We both, being animal lovers, thought we could help them somehow, maybe call a shelter. But in spite of our efforts, the pups would not trust us, not one bit. My girlfriend walked to the other side of the platform to see if there might be more, and at that moment, the dogs went nuts. Maybe they felt surrounded, but it quickly turned into them surrounding us. Even as young dogs, they were fierce and dangerous. They did not trust people. I imagined that they were strays since birth, and that they were at least a year old. I pulled my girlfriend behind me as she started to panic. The dogs kept lunging and barking at us. All I had to defend myself was a bottle, and I did not want to harm an animal if I could help it. So I yelled. I yelled like I was also a wild animal. I tried to match them, show my strength, and hold my ground. The two dogs backed up a little, and so did we. This went on for a few times until we had a decent distance between us, and we just kept walking backwards until we were basically off the walkway and on land. At this point, my girlfriend broke down, and we stopped for a moment. Once we felt safe enough, we continued home, though I kept looking behind me along the way. These aren't all the stories from Turning Point Park, and I'm sure they won't be the last. But no matter where you live, there are always dangers hidden in plain sight. The things we overlook. The reason we are wary about the other side of the tracks. The Girl on the Train Track by Tabby Cat. Everything was dark. The damp, musty smell of decomposing leaves wafts in the humid air, making an odd, squelchy crunch noise. A light flickering in the distance, only adding to the strange, unnerving atmosphere. Crack! My heart starts racing as adrenaline courses through my entire body, making me sprint like a fleeing rabbit to the light. As I glance behind me, a silvery glow emitted from a patch in a gap in the trunks of the trees. I shook my head. I could not be distracted now. Every step made the flickering light come closer. I wanted it to be comforting. My common sense told me it was. But it seemed peculiar. A concrete building loomed from the shadows. Finally, a sign of human civilization. I breathed a sigh of relief, letting my lungs catch up to my beating heart. Glancing around, I could see this station was in a state of disrepair. Moss seeped out of cracks everywhere, leaking like slime out of the nooks and crannies. Ivy strangled the walls, and small chunks of the building were falling out of the platform. A train track lay in front of the station, where a little girl sat. A little girl with jade green eyes that looked back. Red splatters spilled from the corner of her yellow checkered dress, staining the white lace a deep garnet red, the color of blood. I paled, the color draining from my face. I stared into the brilliant green eyes that peered at me, which flashed a dark, bottomless black. No, I whispered. The little girl smiled. Teeth, white as snow and sharp as daggers, beamed at me. A malicious, unnerving smile. And it was gone. Gone, as if was the mere flicker of my weary mind's imagination. But it wasn't. Every day, I kept on seeing more and more of them, the ghosts which came to me by the most mere thought of it. That little girl haunts my life. I see her everywhere, on the dusty benches in the park, on a busy train, everywhere. Others too. But no one believes me. I wish they did. Every day, I carry this ever-increasing burden on my life. This is the only place where I can tell the truth. Otherwise, others will call me a madman. I wish they would believe me. It feels like they are trying to drag me under. I need help. Please. Thank you so much for joining me. You can also find me on Instagram at Duchess of Darkness or Twitter at Duchess of Dark N2. Also, please send me your stories or poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. Until next time.